Picture this. A map, ancient, hand-drawn on papyrus in the Egyptian desert nearly 2,000 years ago. Not a map of roads or rivers, but a map of reality itself. A map that shows you exactly where you are, why you feel the way you feel, and, most remarkably, how to get out. What if that map existed? What if it had always existed? And what if the most powerful institutions in human history spent centuries making sure you would never, ever see it? Welcome to Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. I'm glad you're here for this one, because what we're covering today isn't just ancient philosophy or religious history, it's an instruction manual. A very old, very specific, and very deliberately hidden instruction manual, written by people who believed they had cracked the deepest secret of human existence. In the last episode, we opened the Gnostic files. We met the Demiurge, the false creator, the architect of what the Gnostics called a constructed reality. We explored the Archons, the administrators of that reality, and we drew a disturbing line between those ancient descriptions and what modern researchers and experiencers are reporting today. Today, we go further. Today, we don't just describe the prison. Today, we look for the door. If you're new here and this kind of deep investigation is your thing, the unexplained, the suppressed, the questions that don't have comfortable answers, hit subscribe and drop a like on this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these files travel. You don't need to follow the visuals closely. They're here to set the atmosphere. The story lives in the narration. Now let's begin. To understand the escape plan, we first need to understand what we're escaping from. Last episode, we established the core Gnostic framework, but let me bring everyone up to speed, because this matters. The Gnostics, those early mystical thinkers whose texts were buried in the Egyptian desert and rediscovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi, had a radically different view of reality from anything taught in mainstream religion or conventional history. Their view was this: the world you see around you, the physical, material world, was not created by a supreme, benevolent God. It was created by a lesser, flawed, and in some texts, deeply deceptive being. The Gnostics called this being the Demiurge, and they described it as a kind of cosmic architect who built a reality that looks real, functions like it's real, but is fundamentally a copy, a simulation, you might say, of something far greater that exists beyond it. Think of it like this. Imagine you've lived your entire life inside a snow globe. The world inside the glass looks complete. It has weather, gravity, beauty, suffering, everything you'd expect from reality, but someone on the outside made it, someone is holding it, and the snow globe has walls, even if you've never been able to see them. That, in essence, is the Gnostic model of existence. Now, working beneath the Demiurge are what the texts call the Archons, derived from the Greek word for rulers or authorities. These are the administrators of the constructed reality, the enforcers. In the text known as the Apocryphon of John, one of the most detailed Gnostic cosmological texts found at Nag Hammadi, the Archons are described as having specific roles, specific domains. Each one governs an aspect of the material world that keeps human consciousness anchored here. Fear, desire, confusion, the constant gravitational pull of the physical. And here is the mechanism that haunted Gnostic thinkers most deeply: the reincarnation trap. The Gnostics believed that when a person passes from this life, the soul doesn't simply move on to a higher realm. Instead, without the right knowledge, without what they called Gnosis, the soul is intercepted, processed, cycled back into the material world, memories wiped, divine origin forgotten, over and over, a loop that sustains the system. The text known as the hypostasis of the Archons is explicit about this. The Archons have a vested interest in keeping consciousness here, in this realm, repeating the cycle. Because a soul that remembers what it truly is, that's a soul that doesn't come back. Now, some of you may be thinking, this sounds like a science fiction premise, and you wouldn't be wrong to notice that parallel. Some of the most resonant stories in modern culture, from the concept of a simulated reality to the idea of breaking free from a system designed to keep you compliant, are ancient Gnostic ideas dressed in contemporary clothing. The Gnostics got there first, 2,000 years ago. Which makes you wonder, were they describing something they imagined, or something they somehow knew? But here is where the Gnostic story takes a remarkable turn. Because for all their description of entrapment and constructed reality, the Gnostic texts are not, at their core, pessimistic. They contain a secret, a hidden variable in the equation that changes everything: the divine spark. The Gnostics taught that before the Demiurge completed the construction of the material human being, before the architecture of the body was finished, something happened, something unplanned. A fragment of genuine divine light, originating from the true God, the highest source, what the Gnostics called the pleroma, meaning the fullness, was breathed into the human form, not by the Demiurge, by Sophia, one of the great Aeons, the divine emanations of the true source, whose own complex and tragic story we'll be exploring in full in the next episode. That fragment, that spark, is what the Gnostics believed animates human consciousness at its deepest level. It's not your personality, not your memories, not your ego. It's something beneath all of that, something that the Archons did not put there and cannot remove. The Gospel of Thomas, a text deliberately excluded from the Bible, records Jesus speaking of this directly. He describes a light that exists within every person, a light that, if brought forward, illuminates everything, and if it is not brought forward, darkness. The Archons, according to the texts, are aware of the spark. They cannot destroy it, but they can do something arguably more effective. They can make you forget it's there. Think about that for a moment. You don't need to cage something if you can convince it that it was never free to begin with. And this brings us to one of the most provocative reframings in all of Gnostic thought. Genesis, the Garden of Eden, the serpent. In the standard reading of the Genesis story, the serpent is the deceiver, the villain, the one who tempts Eve, leads humanity into transgression, and triggers the fall from paradise. The Gnostics read that story very differently. In the text known as On the Origin of the World, the serpent is described as an instrument of wisdom, specifically the wisdom of Sophia, sent to wake humanity up. The fruit of the tree of knowledge was not a poison. It was the first act of remembrance, the first moment a human being began to question the reality they had been placed in. And who told them not to eat from that tree? The Demiurge, the false creator who had every reason to keep them docile and unaware. You shall not eat of it, lest you become like gods. That warning, read through Gnostic eyes, is not divine guidance. It is a threat from a being who needed humanity to remain unconscious. The Gnostics saw in this story the oldest conflict in human history, the war between knowledge and control, between remembering what you are and being kept comfortable enough not to ask. And that war, they believed, is still being fought, every single day, in every single human life. So, we know there's a prison. We know there's a spark inside us that doesn't belong to the prison. The question, the one the Gnostics spent their entire lives working on, is this: how do you get out? What's remarkable is that the texts don't leave this as a philosophical question. They answer it in remarkable, specific detail, not as abstract theology, but as a practical sequence, a series of steps that move a person from unconscious captivity toward what the Gnostics called liberation, Gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the divine truth. Let's walk through them. Step 1. Anamnesis, remembrance. The ancient Greek word anamnesis means the undoing of forgetting, not learning something new, remembering something you always knew. The Gnostics taught that the soul's connection to its true divine origin isn't destroyed by incarnation into the material world, it's buried. Layer upon layer of material existence, conditioning, fear, desire, all of it piling on top of something that is still there, still intact, waiting. There is a remarkable Gnostic poem called The Hymn of the Pearl. It tells the story of a prince sent from his divine home into a foreign land to retrieve a precious pearl. But when he arrives, he eats the food of that land, drinks its water, and forgets who he is, forgets why he came, forgets the pearl entirely. He becomes just another inhabitant of the foreign country. Until a letter arrives from home. And when he reads it, he remembers everything. That poem is the blueprint for Anamnesis. You are the prince, this world is the foreign country, and Gnosis, the direct experience of your true nature, is the letter from home. The first step of the Gnostic escape plan is simply this. Stop assuming the reality presented to you is the complete picture. Begin to question, not cynically, not destructively, but with deep, genuine curiosity, because the moment you genuinely ask, "What am I, really?" something in the Gnostic framework begins to stir. It's worth noting that modern contemplative traditions, from certain schools of Buddhism to depth psychology to contemporary consciousness research, all point to a similar first movement. The recognition that the habitual self, the constructed personality, is not the whole story of who you are. The Gnostics framed it more dramatically, but the direction is the same. Step 2. Detachment from Archonic systems. Once the question is alive in you, once anamnesis begins, the Gnostic texts describe the next challenge, and it's a significant one. The Archons maintain control not through force, primarily, but through something far more elegant. They maintain control through attachment. Attachment to physical comfort, to social status, to fear of loss, to guilt, to the constant, restless hunger for more validation, more stimulation, more security. The Gnostics describe these attachments as energetic contracts that bind the soul to the material sphere. Every time you operate purely from fear or desire, the texts suggest you are powering the very system that contains you. Now, here is a modern parallel that I find genuinely remarkable. Consider how the most powerful attention systems of the modern era are specifically engineered to exploit precisely these mechanisms. Fear, outrage, desire, social comparison, infinite novelty designed to prevent stillness. The most sophisticated behavioral engineering in human history is built around keeping human attention perpetually stimulated, perpetually reactive, perpetually hungry. I'm not suggesting the architects of those systems read Gnostic texts. I'm suggesting that whoever, or whatever, understands how to keep consciousness trapped has always known which levers to pull. The tools change, the mechanism doesn't. The Gnostic practice here is not about punishing the body or rejecting the world in anger. It's more nuanced than that. It's a gradual, conscious loosening, noticing when you are operating from unconscious hunger or automatic fear, and in that noticing, creating a space, a moment of sovereignty. That moment, the Gnostics believed, is the divine spark reasserting itself. Step 3. The Ascent through the spheres. Now we move into some of the most specific and fascinating cosmological territory in all of Gnostic writing. The Gnostics described the material reality as existing within a series of concentric spheres, like the layers of an onion, each one governed by an archon. 7 spheres in most accounts, each one a boundary between the soul and the pleroma, the true divine realm beyond all of this. And here is the extraordinary detail. The Gnostic texts describe that when the soul ascends, either through Gnostic practice during life or at the moment of physical departure from it, it must pass through each of these spheres, and at each boundary, an archon waits. not with weapons, but with demands. The Archons at each gate demand something from the ascending soul. What they demand, and what the uninitiated soul cannot provide, is knowledge. Specific knowledge, passwords essentially. Not arbitrary codes, but genuine understanding of the nature of that sphere and of the Archon who governs it. Without this knowledge, without Gnosis, the soul cannot pass. It is turned back, recycled into the material world, another lifetime in the snow globe with no memory of the one before. With Gnosis, with the lived experiential understanding of what each sphere represents, the soul moves through. Each Archon is bypassed not by force, but by recognition. The Gnostic understanding was that an Archon's power over you ends the moment you truly see it for what it is. There is something almost mathematical about this model. The Archons are not omnipotent. They have jurisdiction only over what remains unconscious. The moment consciousness illuminates a thing, truly sees it, names it, understands it, that thing loses its grip. The Pistis Sophia, one of the longest and most detailed Gnostic texts ever found, describes this ascent in extraordinary detail. It reads less like mythology and more like a manual, a very strange, very specific 2,000-year-old manual for navigating what comes next. Step 4. The Bridal Chamber. Once the spheres are passed, once the Archonic gatekeepers have been navigated, the Gnostic texts describe an arrival, a destination, something they called the Bridal Chamber. The Gospel of Philip, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, describes the Bridal Chamber as the highest of all sacred mysteries. Not a physical place, not even a metaphysical location in the conventional sense, but a state, the reunion of the individual divine spark with its source, the pleroma, the fullness. The image the Gnostics used is marriage, not romantic union in any earthly sense, but the reunification of something that was separated, a fragment returning to the whole, the divine spark, scattered into the material world, finding its way home. What's striking is how closely this resonates with what modern researchers studying near-death experiences consistently describe. Across cultures, across languages, across every demographic, people who have approached the edge of physical existence and returned report a remarkably consistent experience, a movement toward an overwhelming light, a sense of recognition, of return, of being welcomed back to something they had always belonged to but somehow forgotten. The Gnostics would not be surprised by those accounts. They would say, those people caught a glimpse through the open door. Step 5. Living knowledge. And this brings us to the fifth and perhaps most important element of the Gnostic escape plan, the one that ties everything together. Gnosis, the knowledge the Gnostics spoke of, cannot be transferred by a book. That statement might seem strange coming from someone who has spent this entire episode discussing written texts, but the Gnostics were explicit about this distinction. The texts are maps, signposts. They point toward something. But the something they point toward must be directly experienced to be real. You cannot read your way to Gnosis any more than you can read your way to knowing what salt tastes like. The Gospel of Thomas records this tension beautifully. Jesus in that text speaks not as a figure dispensing doctrine for believers to accept on faith, but as a teacher pointing toward a direct interior experience. The kingdom is inside you, he says, and it is outside you. Not a future reward, not a distant realm, something present, immediate, accessible, if you know how to look. The Gnostics practiced specific disciplines to cultivate this direct knowing: contemplative silence, interpretive reading designed to activate interior recognition rather than accumulate external information, community rituals designed to dissolve the habitual self, temporarily enough for something deeper to surface. And this, precisely this, is why the texts were considered so dangerous. Because a system built on the management of human consciousness cannot survive a population practicing direct access to something beyond it. In the 4th century, at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine convened a council that would define what was and wasn't considered orthodox Christian doctrine. The decisions made in those chambers were not purely theological, they were political. They were about consolidating a belief system that could function as an empire-wide institution. Texts that granted individuals direct personal access to divine truth, that bypassed institutional authority entirely, were not useful for that project. In fact, they were incompatible with it. You don't need a hierarchy if you can know the divine directly. You don't need approved intermediaries if the knowledge is already inside you. So the Gnostic texts were condemned, communities that used them were pursued, the writings were ordered removed, and for the most part, they were. Except for one jar. Hidden in a cliff near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, sometime in the late 4th century, possibly by monks who understood exactly what was coming, buried and then forgotten for 16 centuries. Until a farmer's shovel struck clay in December 1945 and the jar cracked open and the map tumbled back into the light. When researchers began translating the Nag Hammadi texts in the decades that followed, something unexpected happened. The descriptions in those ancient manuscripts, the constructed reality, the soul as a fragment of divine light temporarily held in matter, the layers of consciousness that must be navigated for liberation, began echoing, eerily, in completely separate fields of modern inquiry. Physicists and philosophers working on simulation theory, the hypothesis that the observable universe may be a kind of information-based construct rather than fundamental physical reality, are using language that maps directly onto the Gnostic Demiurge model, not because they've read the texts, because the questions lead to the same territory. Consciousness researchers, studying phenomena that conventional materialism struggles to explain, are converging on models that describe awareness as something that cannot be fully reduced to the brain, something that may, in some fundamental sense, exist prior to and independently of the physical form it currently occupies. Again, this is the Gnostic divine spark, described in the language of peer-reviewed science. And the researchers studying near-death experiences, documenting thousands of accounts from people who have temporarily left the physical body and returned, are recording experiences that match, with striking precision, the Gnostic description of what happens when the soul begins its ascent, the movement toward light, the encounter with a boundary, the sense of returning to something familiar, the overwhelming recognition. What the Gnostics described as spiritual cosmology, modern investigation is rediscovering as lived human experience. Which brings us to a question I'd like to leave you sitting with. What if the oldest texts on Earth already had the answer? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, a practical map of consciousness, reality, and liberation, written 2,000 years ago by people who somehow knew. And what if someone, or something, made very sure that you would never read them? The Gnostics didn't see themselves as victims of the reality they described. That's the part of this story that I find most remarkable. They saw themselves as navigators, people in possession of something the system couldn't account for, a spark it didn't put there and couldn't take away. They left behind a 5-step map. Remember who you are. Loosen the attachments that bind you. Develop the knowledge that allows you to pass through what waits beyond this life. Trust in the reunion that waits at the end of that journey. And understand, always, that no book can hand you the experience itself. That part is yours to find. Whether you take this as literal spiritual cosmology, as profound psychological metaphor, or as one of the most extraordinary philosophical frameworks ever devised, the questions it raises don't go away. And in my experience, the questions that don't go away are usually pointing at something real. If this episode has sparked something inside you, hit the like button and leave a comment. And if you know someone who asks these kinds of questions, the big ones, the uncomfortable ones, share this with them. That's how these files travel. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Every episode of Weird World Files goes deeper into the abyss of wonder. And where we're going next goes deeper still. But before you go, a seed, something I want you to carry with you. The Archons, the Demiurge, a constructed reality designed to trap the divine spark inside every human being. But the Gnostics didn't just describe the prison, they left us the escape plan. The question is, how did the prison get built in the first place? Her name is Sophia, an Aeon, a divine emanation of the true source, one of the highest beings in the Gnostic cosmos. And through an act of extraordinary, tragic ambition, she reached beyond her nature towards something she couldn't contain. She created without her consort. And what emerged from that act was the Demiurge. Sophia is both the reason we're trapped and the hidden key to getting out. She scattered divine light into matter. She is the grief at the heart of the universe, and she may be the very reason any of us have a spark to awaken in the first place. In the next episode, we cover the myth of Sophia, in detail, in depth, and in all its devastating, magnificent complexity. This is Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.